Today I want to share with you something truly special, a testimony that has the power to change how you think about life, death, and what lies beyond this physical existence we know. This extraordinary account was sent to me by the very person who lived through it, someone who experienced something so profound and transformative that it fundamentally altered their entire understanding of reality itself. They have graciously, generously given me their permission to share their remarkable story with all of you. But they've made one important request that I want to honor completely. They've asked that I carefully change all the names and locations throughout this narrative to protect their privacy and the privacy of everyone who was involved in their experience. I want to be absolutely transparent and honest with you from the very beginning about what has been changed and what remains exactly as it happened. While I have thoughtfully altered these identifying details, like names of people and places, every single spiritual element, every divine encounter, every revelation from beyond, all of it remains exactly, precisely as this person experienced it. I haven't added one word to the spiritual content, and I haven't taken anything away. Not one detail of their encounter with the divine has been modified or embellished in any way whatsoever. The purpose of sharing this powerful, life-changing testimony is to bring you into a deeper awareness and understanding of the spiritual dimension that surrounds us constantly, even when we cannot perceive it with our limited physical senses. My deepest prayer is that this story will speak directly to your heart, strengthen your faith in God and His eternal love for us, help you understand that death is not an ending to be feared, but rather a beautiful transition to something far more glorious, and remind you that we are all eternal spiritual beings temporarily experiencing human life. May this testimony touch your soul and bring you genuine peace about what awaits every one of us when our time in this physical world finally comes to an end. Robert Sullivan had devoted 29 years of his life to protecting and serving the people of southeastern Pennsylvania as a firefighter and emergency medical technician. In 1994, he was working at Fire Station 12, which served the greater Philadelphia metropolitan area, and he approached every single aspect of his work with complete dedication and unwavering commitment. Robert wasn't the kind of person who simply punched a clock and counted down the hours until his shift ended so he could go home. He genuinely, deeply cared about every single person he encountered during emergency responses, treating each individual patient with profound respect, dignity, and compassion, as if they were his own beloved family member or closest friend. He would often make a point to stop by people's homes several days or even weeks after an emergency call, just to check on their recovery progress and see if they needed any assistance or support. He remembered people's names, their children's names, details about their lives, their stories and struggles. His colleagues at the fire station respected and admired him tremendously, not just for his technical skill and medical knowledge, but for his integrity, his compassionate heart, and his genuine kindness toward everyone he met. Beyond his professional identity as a dedicated first responder and emergency medical provider, Robert was deeply passionate about physical fitness and competitive endurance athletics. He had successfully completed more than 35 full marathons across the eastern United States over the years, and had even tackled and finished 4 complete, grueling Ironman triathlon competitions that tested every limit of human endurance. His physical conditioning was absolutely exceptional and remarkable, his cardiovascular system functioning with extraordinary efficiency, and his body operating like a finely tuned precision machine. But despite all of his physical strength and fitness, despite all of his extensive medical training and decades of experience, despite all of his years of responding to countless medical emergencies and life-threatening situations, nothing could have possibly prepared him for what was about to happen during that difficult and challenging winter season. A particularly severe and aggressive influenza epidemic had swept across Pennsylvania and the surrounding mid-Atlantic states that year, hitting the Philadelphia metropolitan area with devastating and overwhelming force. Hospitals and medical facilities throughout the entire region were operating far beyond their designed capacity, stretched to their absolute breaking point. Emergency departments were packed wall to wall, completely filled with desperately ill patients, many of them experiencing serious life-threatening complications from the aggressive flu strain that was circulating. Medical personnel throughout the region were absolutely exhausted, working grueling shifts around the clock, sometimes going 36 or even 48 hours without adequate rest or sleep, doing everything humanly possible to manage the overwhelming surge of critically ill patients that just kept coming in wave after wave. Robert and his crew at Station 12 were responding to medical emergency calls continuously throughout every shift, barely having enough time to restock their ambulance and grab a quick bite to eat between emergency runs. Every single 12-hour shift felt like an impossible endurance test that would never end. Every emergency transport meant encountering another person fighting desperately for their life, another terrified family standing by helplessly, watching in anguish as their loved ones struggled to breathe, struggled to survive. The entire regional emergency medical response system was strained far beyond its normal limits, pushed to the very edge of complete breakdown, and the crisis showed absolutely no signs of ending or even slowing down anytime soon. One particular emergency call during that terrible, devastating flu epidemic would fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of Robert's life in ways he could never have anticipated, predicted, or even imagined in his wildest dreams. He and his regular partner were dispatched to respond to a small row house in the Kensington neighborhood on the northern side of Philadelphia. When they arrived at the narrow brick house and were let inside by a deeply worried and frightened neighbor who had called for emergency help, they discovered a woman who had isolated herself completely in her small bedroom for what appeared to be at least 4 or 5 full days. She had completely sealed herself away in that dark, confined room when the illness first struck her with full force. Every window was covered with thick blankets and old towels to block out all natural light. The door had been kept shut tight. The air inside the cramped room was oppressively hot, thick, stagnant, and difficult to breathe. The woman was in critical, life-threatening condition, her breathing extremely shallow, rapid, and labored, her fever so dangerously elevated and out of control that her skin felt like it was literally radiating intense heat when you came near her. She had been far too weak and disoriented to leave her bed or even call for help herself for many days now. She had been surviving on nothing but sheer willpower and stubborn determination until the neighbor, an elderly woman from next door, had heard her weak moaning and crying through the thin shared wall between their houses, and immediately, without hesitation, called 911 for emergency assistance. Robert instantly shifted into complete emergency response mode, his training and years of experience taking over automatically. He climbed carefully onto the bed and positioned himself strategically so he could properly and securely place an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. His movements were practiced, efficient, confident, and precise, adjusting the elastic straps carefully and methodically, checking meticulously to ensure the mask created a proper, tight seal for optimal oxygen delivery to her starving lungs. But at the precise instant, he leaned forward closely to verify that the mask placement was correct and secure. The woman suddenly coughed violently, a deep rattling cough from her chest, and exhaled forcefully directly into his unprotected face. Robert inhaled at exactly that same unfortunate moment. He felt the warm, moist, contaminated breath rush straight down his throat, directly into his lungs. As a highly trained and experienced EMT with decades of medical knowledge, he recognized immediately and with absolute certainty what had just happened. He had received direct, completely unprotected exposure to whatever virulent, aggressive pathogen this critically ill woman was carrying in her respiratory system. But he firmly pushed the worrying, troubling thought aside and remained completely focused on his patient and her immediate needs. He got her condition stabilized as much as possible under the circumstances, helped his partner carefully and gently load her onto their stretcher, and they transported her with urgent lights and sirens blaring to the nearest hospital emergency department that still had capacity to accept additional critical patients during the overwhelming crisis. Less than 48 hours later, Robert began experiencing symptoms that were more severe, more frightening, and more intense than anything he had ever encountered or experienced in his entire life. The illness attacked his body with shocking, brutal speed and overwhelming intensity. His body temperature spiked dangerously high, climbing rapidly to 105 degrees and continuing to rise beyond that. Every single muscle and joint throughout his entire body ached with intense, grinding, unbearable pain that made even the slightest movement feel almost impossible. His head pounded relentlessly, with such severe, crushing pressure that even the dimmest light or the quietest sound became absolutely unbearable torture to his hypersensitive nervous system. But what frightened and terrified him most deeply, what truly made him realize the severity of his condition, was the rapid, relentless, uncontrollable dehydration that was literally draining his life away hour by hour. His body was violently rejecting absolutely everything. He couldn't keep down water, food, medication, nothing at all would stay in his system for more than a few minutes. His digestive system was in complete, total rebellion and chaos, purging fluids rapidly and violently from every possible direction simultaneously. He could literally feel his body shutting down systematically, organ by organ, his strength evaporating and disappearing hour by hour as his vital organs began failing progressively from acute, severe, life-threatening dehydration. On the third full day of this absolute nightmare, this living hell, Robert attempted with tremendous effort to get himself out of his bed. His legs immediately buckled and collapsed underneath him as if they were made of rubber. He grabbed desperately, frantically onto the edge of the wooden nightstand to prevent himself from falling completely to the floor and somehow, using every last ounce of remaining strength, managed to stumble and half crawl across the bedroom to the small bathroom. When he finally looked at his reflection in the mirror above the bathroom sink, what he saw staring back at him shocked him into a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity and recognition. The face reflected in that mirror looked like death personified, like a corpse that was somehow still animated. His face had become completely skeletal in appearance, the skin pulled so impossibly tight over his skull that every bone structure was sharply, clearly visible. His eyes had receded deep into dark, hollow, sunken sockets that looked like empty caves. His skin had taken on a grayish-yellow pallor, an unhealthy color that looked exactly like a dead body. He genuinely, honestly looked like a dead man, who was somehow still standing upright and breathing. Robert's extensive medical training and decades of experience automatically activated and took over. He reached down with his trembling, shaking hands to check his radial pulse at his wrist, a fundamental, basic vital sign assessment that he had performed literally thousands upon thousands of times on patients throughout his long, distinguished career in emergency medicine. He pressed his fingers firmly, deliberately against the inside of his wrist, searching desperately, hopefully for that familiar, reassuring, rhythmic beating, that steady pulse that indicates life. Nothing. He couldn't detect anything at all, not even the faintest flutter. He pressed harder, applied more pressure, moved his fingers carefully and methodically to slightly different positions, tried his other wrist with equal determination and desperate focus. Still absolutely nothing whatsoever. He couldn't locate a pulse anywhere on his body, couldn't find any sign of that vital rhythm. His extensive medical knowledge and years of training immediately told him exactly what this critical sign meant, what this absence indicated. His blood pressure had dropped catastrophically, dangerously low, almost certainly below 60 millimeters of mercury, quite possibly even lower than that. His heart was racing frantically, desperately, beating at what felt like 170 or even 180 beats per minute, working overtime trying to compensate. But his blood pressure was so dangerously, critically, life-threateningly low that the peripheral pulse in his wrists and extremities had completely vanished, disappeared entirely. Robert somehow, through sheer force of will, summoned enough remaining strength to get himself back from the bathroom to the bedroom. He called out weakly, desperately, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper, to his family members in the house. His younger brother, an experienced registered nurse who had been staying with Robert and his wife that week, specifically, to help care for their elderly mother who lived with them, heard his brother's weak voice and came running immediately into the bedroom. He took one quick look at Robert's critical condition, at his deathly appearance, and his face went completely pale with instant recognition, profound fear, and alarm. He grabbed the telephone on the bedside table without any hesitation and quickly dialed 911. Within just 7 minutes, a Philadelphia Fire Department rescue unit arrived at the residence, colleagues and close personal friends who had worked side by side with Robert for many, many years. When they entered the bedroom and saw the absolutely critical, dire condition he was in, several of them had visible tears forming and welling up in their eyes, their faces showing shock and deep concern for their friend and colleague. They immediately, without any delay, established 2 large-bore intravenous lines in his arms and began running normal saline solution wide open at maximum flow rate, trying desperately, urgently to replace at least some of his catastrophic, life-threatening fluid loss and stabilize his crashing blood pressure. They loaded him as carefully, gently, and smoothly as possible onto their ambulance stretcher and transported him Code 3, full lights blazing and sirens blaring, absolute maximum priority, to the regional Level 1 Trauma Center at Temple University Hospital in North Philadelphia, approximately 30 to 35 minutes away through heavy city traffic, which had the advanced medical resources, specialized equipment, and intensive care staffing necessary to handle the most critical, complex cases during the ongoing epidemic emergency crisis. When Robert arrived at the trauma center's massive, sprawling emergency department, the scene was one of barely controlled chaos, overwhelming activity, and intense pressure. The enormous waiting room was completely packed full of patients, sitting, standing, some lying on the floor, many of them obviously gravely, critically ill and suffering. Every single treatment room and examination bay throughout the entire emergency department was occupied with patients receiving care. Long rows of gurneys lined both sides of the main hallways and corridors, with patients waiting desperately, sometimes for many hours, to be evaluated, assessed, and treated by overwhelmed medical staff. Medical personnel, doctors, nurses, technicians, were literally running, sprinting from room to room to room, their faces showing the profound exhaustion, stress, and strain from working impossibly long hours day after day after day, shift after shift, trying desperately to manage the completely overwhelming patient volume that just kept coming, that never seemed to stop or even slow down. Robert was wheeled rapidly, urgently into a treatment bay where an emergency medicine physician, who looked like he hadn't slept properly or adequately in at least 3 or 4 full days, was working frantically, almost desperately, to manage what seemed like an utterly impossible, completely hopeless situation. The exhausted, overwhelmed physician had essentially implemented a standardized treatment algorithm and clinical protocol for all influenza patients coming through his overwhelmed emergency department during the crisis. The clinical approach was straightforward, practical, evidence-based, and efficient given the desperate circumstances and limited resources. Administer appropriate analgesic pain medication to provide comfort, typically a morphine-based compound or synthetic derivative, combined with effective antiemetic medication to control nausea and vomiting, and help patients tolerate oral rehydration solutions and keep fluids down. The doctor was moving with urgent speed and efficiency from patient to patient to patient, barely taking adequate time to review individual medical charts or patient histories anymore. He was operating on autopilot, following the protocol mechanically. He was simply trying his best to keep as many people alive as humanly possible and provide at least some measure of relief and comfort from their terrible, intense suffering while the epidemic continued its devastating course through the entire community, through the entire region. Robert remained in that crowded, noisy, chaotic treatment bay for approximately 55 minutes to an hour. The intravenous fluids gradually, slowly began to take some beneficial effect and provide some relief to his severely compromised system. 4 complete 1-liter bags of normal saline solution flowed steadily, continuously into his severely, dangerously dehydrated circulatory system, and he started to feel just marginally slightly more human, coherent, alert, and present. His heart rate began to decrease somewhat, slowly coming down from its frantic, desperate pace. The severe confusion, disorientation, and fog clouding his mind started to clear just a little bit, just enough for him to think somewhat more clearly and rationally about his situation. He managed with considerable effort and determination to sit himself upright on the gurney and told his wife, who had followed the ambulance separately to the hospital in their family car with their teenage daughter, that he thought he might possibly be stable enough now, sufficiently improved, to continue his recovery at home, in his own comfortable, familiar bed. They could manage aggressive oral rehydration there with electrolyte solutions and sports drinks, he reasoned hopefully, somewhat optimistically, and he would certainly feel better, more comfortable, and recover more quickly in his own familiar, comfortable surroundings, in his own home. But the nurse who came to check his vital signs and assess his condition explained patiently but very firmly, with no room for negotiation, that hospital protocol during the epidemic emergency crisis was absolutely clear, specific, and non-negotiable. Every single patient presenting with this particular constellation of symptoms received the standardized medication regimen before discharge, and absolutely no exceptions were being made for anyone, regardless of their profession, their connections, their status, or their personal preferences. The emergency department was strictly, rigidly following evidence-based clinical guidelines and protocols to ensure consistency and quality of care across all patients during the crisis. Robert, who had always deeply respected medical authority and understood thoroughly the critical importance of following established clinical protocols and guidelines, who had spent his entire career following and enforcing protocols himself, simply nodded his acceptance and agreement without argument or protest. He trusted the medical system completely and without reservation. He had been an integral, dedicated, committed part of that very system for nearly 3 full decades of his professional life. What happened in the next few critical minutes would become permanently, indelibly seared into his wife's memory and consciousness, haunting her dreams and nightmares for many, many years to come. The nurse carefully, methodically prepared 2 syringes at the medication preparation and dispensing station, one containing Nubain, which is a potent synthetic morphine derivative compound with powerful analgesic and pain-relieving properties, and another containing a strong, effective antiemetic medication specifically designed and formulated to control severe nausea and vomiting. Robert was sitting upright on the very edge of the gurney, actually beginning to swing his legs over the side to stand up and get dressed for discharge home, when the nurse approached professionally and competently and administered both medications directly and rapidly into his intravenous port access. She pushed them in quickly, efficiently, competently, emptying both syringes completely in rapid succession, perhaps 10 to 15 seconds total administration time. Within just moments, perhaps only 5 to 8 seconds at the very most, Robert's eyes suddenly dramatically rolled upward and backward in his head, until only the whites were clearly visible to anyone watching. His wife later described it as one of the single most terrifying, disturbing, horrifying things she had ever witnessed or experienced in her entire life. It looked completely unnatural, wrong, disturbing, and nightmarish, like something from a horror film or a medical emergency training video. Then his entire body went completely, totally rigid, every single muscle simultaneously locked and contracted in severe, intense spasm. He toppled straight backward onto the gurney like a felled tree, hitting it hard with significant impact, completely unconscious, completely unresponsive, before his head even made contact with the thin, inadequate institutional pillow covered in disposable paper. Immediately, instantly, within just seconds, the treatment bay absolutely exploded with urgent emergency activity and controlled chaos. A full code blue emergency was called loudly, urgently overhead through the entire hospital's public address announcement system. Medical personnel came running rapidly and converging from every conceivable direction throughout the emergency department and even from other floors. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, medical students, residents all swarmed densely around Robert's gurney in organized but intense chaos, everyone knowing their role, everyone focused. They instantly, immediately recognized exactly what was happening, what they were dealing with. Robert was experiencing a severe, life-threatening adverse reaction to the administered medications, essentially an iatrogenic overdose causing profound respiratory depression and catastrophic, potentially fatal cardiovascular collapse and shock. Someone quickly grabbed a vial of Narcan from the nearby mobile crash cart and administered it rapidly, urgently intravenously through his IV line. Narcan is the specific emergency reversal agent for opiate and opioid overdoses. It functions by immediately blocking opiate receptors throughout the entire body and brain and rapidly reversing their dangerous, potentially lethal effects. They gave Robert one complete full dose intravenously, pushing it in fast, then quickly, urgently followed with a second full dose within just 60 seconds. Additional intravenous access was rapidly established with even larger bore catheters to maximize fluid delivery capacity. The gurney was immediately tilted into steep Trendelenburg position, head down, feet significantly elevated, in an attempt to maximize available blood flow and perfusion to his brain and other absolutely vital organs. But despite all of these aggressive, appropriate, textbook-perfect interventions performed rapidly and competently by highly skilled, experienced medical professionals, Robert's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly, alarmingly, frighteningly. His blood pressure had plummeted catastrophically to 34/0. Essentially, technically, his heart was still mechanically beating and contracting rhythmically, but it wasn't generating anywhere near sufficient pressure to adequately perfuse his organs and tissues with desperately needed oxygenated blood throughout his body and extremities. The experienced trauma team made an immediate, urgent decision, without hesitation, to transfer him directly to the intensive care unit on the 6th floor. They worked on him intensively, continuously throughout the entire long, dark, difficult night, constantly, continuously adjusting medications and dosages, titrating drips, monitoring his vital signs minute by minute, second by second, doing absolutely everything medically possible, appropriate and indicated to keep him alive, to keep his heart beating, to keep oxygen flowing to his brain. When morning finally arrived and the ICU attending physician made his early morning rounds, he sat down with Robert's wife and brother in a small private consultation room to explain carefully, thoroughly, and in considerable detail what had happened from a physiological, biochemical and medical standpoint. The morphine-based medication Robert received caused something called systemic vasodilation throughout his entire circulatory system and vascular tree. The doctor explained carefully, patiently and thoroughly, using his hands to gesture and illustrate his points. He tried earnestly to explain the complex physiology in clear, simple terms that she could understand and comprehend without extensive medical background or training. Imagine your blood vessels, your arteries, veins, and tiny capillaries as an incredibly complex, intricate network of tubes and pipes filled with fluid, he said slowly and clearly, making sure she was following. Under normal, healthy physiological conditions, those tubes maintain a certain specific diameter and caliber, and there's sufficient blood volume circulating inside them to completely fill that vascular space and create the pressure that's absolutely necessary and critical for proper circulation throughout your entire body and all your organs and tissues. But the medication Robert received caused all of his blood vessels to dilate dramatically, suddenly and significantly. The walls of the tubes expanded rapidly and substantially, opening up much wider than normal. Suddenly, instantaneously, the volume of blood in his body, which had already been significantly, severely depleted by 3 full days of severe, uncontrolled dehydration and fluid loss, was nowhere near sufficient or adequate to fill this dramatically, suddenly expanded vascular space. There simply wasn't enough fluid volume to maintain pressure. His blood pressure collapsed absolutely, catastrophically, and his entire body began shutting down systemically, organ by organ, system by system. The doctor explained honestly, directly, and candidly that the only reason Robert was probably likely still alive at all, the only reason they were having this conversation, was his truly exceptional, remarkable cardiovascular conditioning from literally decades of competitive endurance athletics and consistent dedicated training and exercise. His heart and entire circulatory system were so remarkably efficient, so exceptionally well-trained and conditioned at delivering oxygen even under extreme physiological stress and adverse conditions, that even with dangerously, critically, life-threateningly low blood pressure, his vital organs had somehow, miraculously, managed to receive just barely enough oxygen to avoid complete and irreversible catastrophic failure and death. Robert never regained consciousness in any conventional medical sense during that long, dark, difficult night in the intensive care unit. His physical body lay completely motionless, still and unresponsive on that hospital bed, surrounded by constantly beeping monitors, humming ventilators, and quietly operating life support machines and equipment. But sometime between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, when his physical form was hovering precariously on the very edge, the absolute razor's edge between life and death, something absolutely extraordinary, miraculous, and profound happened that would change his understanding of reality forever. Robert left his body completely. The experience began with a sensation that he would spend literally the rest of his entire life trying desperately to find adequate words to properly, accurately describe and explain to others. It felt as if he had been imprisoned, trapped, confined inside a cramped, hot, suffocating cell or box for as long as he could possibly remember or imagine, perhaps his entire existence. And suddenly, instantly, miraculously, without any warning whatsoever, the walls simply dissolved and vanished completely into nothingness. He was released, freed, liberated into boundless, limitless, infinite space and freedom. The relief was so overwhelming, so complete and absolute and total, that it brought him immediately to a state of ecstatic, rapturous, overwhelming joy far beyond anything he had ever experienced, felt, or imagined possible during his entire physical life on Earth. He found himself floating peacefully, serenely, blissfully, in a vast, infinite, limitless expanse filled with massive, enormous, luminous spheres of different brilliant, beautiful, vibrant colors, blues and purples and golds and greens and colors he had never seen before, colors that don't exist in the physical world. These weren't stars as we see them twinkling distantly in the night sky. They were conscious beings, living entities, souls composed entirely of pure light and divine, sacred energy, and they radiated such powerful, unconditional, limitless love and complete acceptance that Robert felt like he was being embraced tenderly, lovingly by the very heart and essence of the universe itself, by God himself, by pure love incarnate. He understood immediately, instinctively, intuitively, that these were what various spiritual and religious traditions throughout history call light beings, or angelic presences, or divine messengers, or celestial beings, or heavenly hosts. But reading about them in books, or hearing second-hand descriptions from others, was absolutely nothing. Nothing at all compared to experiencing them directly, immediately, personally, firsthand. This was real. This was actually happening to him right now. This was infinitely more beautiful, magnificent, glorious, and awe-inspiring than anything he could have possibly conceived of, dreamed of, or imagined in his wildest dreams or fantasies. Robert himself no longer existed in any kind of physical form whatsoever. He had become an expansive, vast, infinite field of pure consciousness without any boundaries, limitations, restrictions, or constraints whatsoever. The sensation was indescribably, impossibly, incredibly pleasurable, blissful, far beyond any possible comparison to physical pleasure, earthly joy, or human happiness that he had ever known. It was as if every atom of his being, every particle of his consciousness, every fiber of his existence was vibrating and resonating harmoniously with pure, absolute, perfect joy and ecstasy and bliss. If he had to try desperately to describe it, using physical analogies and comparisons from earthly experience, from his physical life, he said it felt exactly like warm golden liquid light was being poured gently, lovingly, continuously, directly into the very core, the very center of his consciousness, his being, and then radiating outward powerfully, brilliantly, through every single aspect of his existence, his being, bringing absolutely everything alive with rapture and ecstasy and perfect bliss and contentment. The pleasure was so intense, so all-encompassing, so overwhelming and complete and perfect that it made every good feeling, every moment of happiness, every experience of joy he had ever experienced during his entire physical life seem like a faint, pale, insignificant shadow by comparison, like a candle compared to the sun. It was like comparing a single tiny candle flame flickering in darkness to the brilliant, blazing, overwhelming light of the sun, at high noon on a clear summer day at the equator. As he moved through this infinite space, he described it as flying or floating or gliding or simply being, though there was no air or physical space in any conventional, material, three-dimensional sense that we understand. surrounded constantly, lovingly by these welcoming, loving, joyful beings of pure light and divine energy, these beings that radiated such love and acceptance, Faye's profound realization struck him with such tremendous, overwhelming force that it shook him to his absolute core, to the very foundation of his being, to the essence of who he thought he was. How had he forgotten? How was it even remotely possible, conceivable, that he had been so completely, thoroughly, totally convinced, so absolutely certain that he was Robert Sullivan, a firefighter and paramedic from Philadelphia, with a specific career and family relationships and daily responsibilities and concerns and worries and fears and anxieties and bills to pay and problems to solve. Because existing there, floating there, being there, in that space of pure consciousness and infinite love, in that realm of light, he knew with absolute, complete, unshakable, unquestionable certainty that all of that, the entire physical life, every bit of it, was ultimately, fundamentally, an elaborate illusion, a temporary experience, a dream, a play, a game. His true identity, his authentic, real, eternal self, was this vast, eternal, limitless consciousness, this boundless being of pure light and unconditional love and infinite awareness and divine essence. The human life, the physical existence, the personality and memories and experiences of Robert Sullivan, all of it was like a costume or outfit or disguise he had put on temporarily for a theatrical play or performance, a role he had agreed to perform temporarily, a character he was playing, and he had become so deeply, completely absorbed in the performance, so thoroughly identified with the character that he had totally, completely forgotten he was an actor playing a part, wearing a costume, performing a role. The physical world, with all of its drama and pain and struggle and suffering and fear and anxiety and competition and conflict, was a temporary experience, a temporary classroom, a school, an intricate, elaborate game that came with being born into a material, physical, mortal body made of flesh and blood. But this realm of infinite light and unconditional love and limitless consciousness and perfect peace and eternal joy, this was home. This was ultimate reality. This was who he truly was and had always been since the very beginning of time, since before time itself existed, since before the universe was created. After what felt simultaneously like both a single instant and an eternity, time simply didn't function, operate, or exist normally in that realm at all. It seemed completely fluid, or perhaps non-existent. Robert felt himself gently, gradually descending and landing somewhere specific, somewhere intentional and purposeful. The sensation of floating through infinite space gradually, slowly stopped, ceased, and he became aware of standing firmly on something solid, real, and substantial beneath him, beneath his feet, or what he perceived as feet. He looked around with wonder, amazement, awe, and curiosity, and saw that he was inside some kind of facility, structure, or building of some kind. It had walls that seemed to radiate their own soft, gentle, warm, comforting illumination from no identifiable, visible, or discernible light source that he could detect. There were tables positioned strategically, purposefully throughout the space, and various pieces of equipment or machinery or instruments that he couldn't quite identify, recognize, understand, or comprehend their purpose or function. The entire place felt purposeful, organized, intentional, and functional, but also somehow simultaneously playful, joyful, loving, and welcoming, like a workshop or laboratory where important but deeply enjoyable, meaningful work was being accomplished with joy and love and dedication. And then he noticed them standing there patiently, waiting. 3 short beings positioned directly in front of him, watching him with obvious delight, amusement, joy, and deep affection and love. These 3 beings were unlike anything Robert had ever seen, encountered, experienced, or imagined in his entire life on Earth, in all his years of living. They stood approximately 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with compact, sturdy, solid, robust builds and frames. They wore what appeared to be dark robes or cloaks with hoods attached, but the hoods were pushed back sufficiently, far enough that Robert could clearly, distinctly see their faces in considerable detail. They looked somewhat like the gnomes or dwarves or elves from ancient fairy tales, mythology, and folklore, with round, friendly, kind, Gentle faces and incredibly bright, sparkling, twinkling, luminous eyes that seemed to contain infinite depth and wisdom. And they were smiling, huge, genuine, authentic, ear-to-ear smiles that radiated pure joy, playful mischief, childlike wonder, and profound, deep, unconditional love and acceptance. Their eyes twinkled and sparkled brilliantly with playfulness, humor, and ancient, timeless, infinite wisdom and knowledge. They reminded Robert of excited, joyful, delighted children who had just been told the most wonderful, amazing news imaginable, except these beings were clearly, obviously, ancient, timeless, eternal, and infinitely wise, despite their playful, childlike demeanor, behavior, and energy and enthusiasm. The three beings immediately, without any delay whatsoever, began asking Robert questions in rapid succession, speaking in overlapping, musical, harmonious voices that had a joyful, almost giggling, laughing quality to them that was infectious. "How was your journey down there in the physical world?" one asked with obvious enthusiasm, excitement, and genuine interest and curiosity. "Tell us absolutely everything you experienced. We want to hear all about it," another exclaimed eagerly, enthusiastically, bouncing slightly with anticipation and excitement and impatience. "What did you discover? What did you learn? What was it like? How do you feel now? What surprised you the most?" The third one added enthusiastically, rapidly, practically vibrating, humming with excitement and curiosity and eagerness. They were exactly, precisely like dear, beloved, cherished old friends welcoming someone home after a long, extended journey or trip abroad, eager and excited and impatient to hear all about the adventure, the experiences, the lessons learned, the stories and tales from the journey. Robert stood there feeling somewhat disoriented, confused, overwhelmed, uncertain, and off balance. He had a strange, odd, peculiar sense that he should recognize and know these beings, that they were somehow deeply familiar to him on some profound, deep, fundamental level of his being. But his memory felt foggy, clouded, unclear, murky, and inaccessible, like trying to remember a dream. He tried earnestly, desperately to gather his scattered, disorganized thoughts so he could respond appropriately, adequately to their enthusiastic, eager, sincere questions, and give them the answers they seemed to want. Then one of the three turned to his two companions, gestured toward Robert with an amused, playful, affectionate expression on his friendly face, and said something that made all three of them burst into absolutely delighted, infectious, joyful laughter that filled the space. "Look at him, he doesn't remember us at all, not even a little bit. He's completely forgotten who we are," the being announced cheerfully, joyfully, finding tremendous humor in this situation, and they all found this absolutely hilarious, amusing, entertaining, and delightful. They laughed and nudged each other affectionately, playfully, clearly finding tremendous humor, joy, and delight in the situation, in Robert's confusion and forgetfulness. Robert wanted to protest immediately, wanted to explain earnestly that he did feel some sense of recognition, familiarity, and connection to them, that there was something he couldn't quite place or identify about them, even if he couldn't remember specific details or memories or their names. But before he could form and speak the words, before he could articulate his thoughts, his attention was suddenly powerfully drawn to another presence approaching from somewhere deeper within the structure, from further back in the facility, moving toward them. This new being was completely and utterly different from the three hooded figures in every possible way, in every conceivable aspect and characteristic. He was extraordinarily, impossibly tall, perhaps 8 or 9 or even 10 feet if you attempted to measure him using conventional measurements and standards, and impossibly incredibly slender, thin, with a form that appeared to be composed entirely of luminous mist or vapor, or fog, rather than any kind of solid, physical, material matter or substance. He reminded Robert of a stretched, elongated version of those flexible clay animation characters, or perhaps like an impossibly tall, thin willow tree swaying gently in a soft breeze, except his entire body. His entire form seemed to be made of swirling, glowing, luminous fog or mist or vapor that moved and flowed. When this extraordinary being moved and walked, approaching them, it was absolutely mesmerizing, hypnotic, beautiful, and captivating to watch and observe. Different parts of his form would drift apart gracefully, elegantly, and then flow smoothly, beautifully, harmoniously back together. Like watching someone move gracefully underwater, where gentle currents catch their clothing and hair and create beautiful, fluid, graceful, dance-like patterns and movements. Despite his unusual, extraordinary, and completely otherworldly appearance and form, he had a distinct, clear, recognizable face, and that face wore the most beautiful, warm, radiant, loving, compassionate smile Robert had ever witnessed or experienced in his entire existence. His eyes were absolutely extraordinary, remarkable, stunning, luminous, brilliant, shining, and filled with such profound, overwhelming, infinite love and compassion and acceptance that Robert could barely stand to look directly into them for more than a brief moment without feeling completely overwhelmed, without feeling like he might simply dissolve into that love, merge with it, become one with it completely. This tall, misty, luminous being appeared to be overseeing, supervising, or coordinating the operation, though overseeing or supervising don't quite capture the right feeling, dynamic, relationship, or interaction accurately. There was absolutely no sense of rigid hierarchy or authoritarian control or command structure or dominance or power differential. Everything felt collaborative, cooperative, equal, harmonious, and joyful, like everyone was participating together equally, harmoniously in something wonderful, meaningful, sacred, important, and beautiful. When the tall being came close to Robert, when he approached within just a few feet, something powerful, overwhelming, profound, and transformative happened that Robert had never experienced before. Robert felt his chest cavity expand dramatically, powerfully, as if his heart was suddenly growing far too large for his physical body, as if his heart was expanding infinitely to fill the entire universe. At the exact same moment, simultaneously, his throat constricted and tightened severely, intensely, making it difficult to breathe or swallow. A massive, powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion crashed over him like a tsunami, like a giant ocean wave, completely engulfing him. He felt like he was about to break down into completely uncontrollable weeping and sobbing, not from sadness or grief or pain of any kind, but from the sheer, overwhelming, almost unbearable intensity of the pure, unconditional, infinite love radiating and emanating powerfully from this being, flowing from him like water from a fountain. It was love so complete, so unconditional, so infinite and boundless and limitless and perfect, that Robert felt like he might simply dissolve completely into it, merge with it, become one with it, lose himself in it completely. It felt like standing directly in the immediate presence of divine love itself, of God himself, being bathed in it, immersed in it, surrounded completely by it, consumed by it, becoming part of it. The atmosphere and environment in this space was surprisingly informal, casual, relaxed, welcoming, and unstructured, not at all what Robert might have expected. The three little hooded beings kept giggling cheerfully amongst themselves, occasionally whispering to each other conspiratorially, and then bursting into more cheerful, delighted, joyful laughter that echoed through the space. The tall, misty being just stood there calmly, peacefully, serenely radiating that absolutely overwhelming, infinite love and peace, smiling gently, warmly, compassionately, and occasionally chuckling softly, deeply at something only he seemed to perceive, understand, or find amusing. After several long moments of this, Robert decided he needed to take some initiative and move things forward somehow, to progress to the next stage, whatever that might be. He looked up at the tall being and said, trying to sound confident, "Well, I'm clearly not going back there to that other place, to that physical world. So should we proceed with whatever comes next in this process? I've read about life reviews in books and testimonies. Is that what we're going to do now? Should we review my life together?" The tall being's response caught Robert completely off guard and surprised him thoroughly, completely. The being threw his head back gracefully, elegantly, and released a deep, rich, warm, joyful laugh that seemed to resonate and vibrate through Robert's entire being, through his entire consciousness, through everything. It was the kind of laugh that was so genuine, warm, authentic, and full of pure joy that it made you want to laugh along joyfully, happily, even if you didn't understand what was funny, amusing, or entertaining about the situation. When the laughter subsided gradually, gently, slowly, the being looked down at Robert with those impossibly loving, compassionate, understanding, accepting eyes and said warmly, gently, kindly, with no judgment whatsoever, "Sure, absolutely. Let's do that if you'd like to. Where would you like to start? What would you like to talk about or discuss or explore together?" The complete casualness, informality, friendliness, and lack of judgment of it stunned and surprised Robert thoroughly, completely. This didn't match, align with, or resemble any of the structured, formal, serious, systematic life review processes he had read about in books, articles, and testimonies from others. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of organized evaluation, some systematic accounting and judgment of one's actions, choices, decisions, a weighing of the soul? But the being's demeanor was so relaxed, so friendly, welcoming, accepting, and completely non-judgmental, radiating only love and acceptance, that Robert simply decided to go along with it and see what happened next. He began sharing some memories and stories from his physical life, from his time on Earth in that body, but nothing particularly dramatic, weighty, significant, or important emerged from his consciousness. There were no terrible regrets weighing heavily on his soul, no major sins requiring judgment or redemption, or forgiveness or atonement or punishment. He mentioned one thing that came to his mind. Several years back, probably 7 or 8 years ago now, there had been an opportunity, a possibility for him to take a position as a wilderness ranger in the Pocono Mountains. His wife had been really excited and enthusiastic about the possibility, the opportunity, the adventure it represented. They would have spent an entire summer season living in a remote ranger station, surrounded by pristine wilderness and natural beauty and solitude, away from the constant stress, trauma, pressure, and intensity of emergency response work and the chaos of the city. But Robert had declined the position, turned down the opportunity, choosing instead to remain with the fire department, where he felt he could continue making a real, tangible, meaningful difference in people's lives during their most desperate, frightening, vulnerable moments when they needed help most. Looking back now from this perspective, from this vantage point, he found himself wishing, hoping he had accepted that ranger position. It would have been a beautiful, peaceful, restorative, rejuvenating experience, a cherished season with his beloved wife immersed in nature, beauty, and tranquility. That was honestly, truly, the only significant regret that surfaced in his consciousness, the only thing that came to mind as something he wished he had done differently. The tall being listened with patient attention, nodding occasionally, gently, his expression radiating gentle understanding, complete acceptance and unconditional love without any trace of judgment. When Robert finished speaking, when he had nothing more to add, the being smiled even more warmly and said kindly, gently, compassionately, "All right, that's sufficient for now. It's time for you to return back to your body now." The words hit Robert like a physical blow to the chest, like being struck by lightning. Return. He stared at the being with complete disbelief, shock, horror, and growing panic and desperation. "Return?" he repeated, his voice rising with emotion, fear, desperation, pleading. "No, absolutely not. There's no way I'm going back there. Are you serious right now? I'm finally home. I'm finally in the place where I truly belong and have always belonged. Please don't make me go back to that place." But the tall being's demeanor remained absolutely gentle, compassionate, loving, yet completely immovable, firm and final. "No," he said simply, clearly, gently, and definitively. "You have important work that still needs to be completed down there, work that only you can do, a mission to fulfill. You're going back to finish it now." Robert suddenly realized and noticed that the 3 little hooded beings had completely vanished and disappeared from the space. They had simply ceased to be there, presumably reassigned to other tasks or responsibilities or missions in whatever this facility or realm or dimension was. Now it was just Robert and the tall, misty being alone together in that space. The being moved even closer, approaching, and Robert knew with desperate certainty that he had to make one final attempt to stay in this beautiful place, one last plea, one final argument. He looked up with pleading, desperate, anguished eyes filled with longing and said urgently, desperately, "Please listen to me carefully, please hear me. The only people who will genuinely miss me are my wife, my daughter, and my elderly parents. Yes, they'll experience grief and terrible sadness for some period of time, but they're remarkably strong, resilient, capable people. They'll mourn appropriately and properly, and then they'll heal emotionally, and they'll move forward successfully with their lives. They'll ultimately be okay and fine without me. There's really no compelling reason for me to go back there." Robert genuinely thought this was a reasonable, logical, and convincing argument, his final card to play. But the tall being simply found it touching, endearing, and somewhat amusing. He smiled even more warmly, radiating infinite compassion and understanding, and said again with absolute finality, complete certainty, "No, Robert, you're going back now. It's time. Trust me." In that precise instant, everything around Robert began to dissolve, disintegrate, and fragment before his eyes. It was exactly like watching a television picture break up and fragment when you rapidly switch channels or suddenly lose the broadcast signal completely. The glowing walls, the tables, the mysterious equipment, the soft illumination, everything started to disintegrate and fade away gradually into nothingness, into void, into darkness. Robert understood intuitively and immediately what was happening to him, what was occurring. He was being shifted to a different vibrational frequency of existence, a different dimension, being tuned to a different station. He realized in that profound moment that all of reality, absolutely everything that exists across all dimensions and planes and realms, operates on different vibrational frequencies, exactly like different stations on a radio dial that you can tune in and out of. You can have completely different dimensions and realities occupying exactly the same space, the same location in the universe, just vibrating at different rates, different frequencies that normally can't perceive, detect, or interact with each other. He felt himself descending rapidly, sinking downward through multiple layers or levels or dimensions of reality. And it was an unmistakable sensation of lowering, of decreasing in vibration and frequency, of becoming denser, heavier, more solid, more material. The tall being faded away gradually, gently like morning mist evaporating under the warmth of rising sunlight, and Robert fell away into complete, total, absolute darkness, into void, descending rapidly. As he descended back toward his physical body, as he dropped down through these various layers or dimensions or frequencies of reality, moving between worlds, he passed through a realm that filled him with profound dread, fear, terror, and horror, unlike anything he had ever felt. For many years afterward, he was reluctant and hesitant to mention this particular part of his experience to anyone, afraid people would think he was crazy or making it up. But eventually he came to realize it was crucially important for people to know, understand, and be aware of this place. There exists a place, a dimension or realm very close in frequency to our ordinary physical world that you absolutely, positively, do not want to visit or spend any time in whatsoever, under any circumstances. It exists at a vibrational frequency just slightly different from our material reality, just a small shift away, and it is a place of terrible, crushing, overwhelming loneliness and desolation and despair. It is grey and empty and cold and lifeless and hopeless and utterly devoid of love. There is no love present there, no light, no warmth, no connection between beings, no hope or joy of any kind whatsoever. It's a realm of complete isolation and quiet, desperate, overwhelming despair and suffering without end. Robert felt it pulling at his consciousness as he passed through it, like invisible hands trying to grab him, grasp him, and hold him there, trap him there forever, and he wanted absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with that place, that realm, that dimension. It served as a stark and sobering reminder that not all non-physical dimensions and realms are beautiful and welcoming and filled with love and light. Some are genuinely dark and frightening and dangerous and horrible, and souls can apparently become trapped or lost or stuck there if they're not extremely careful, vigilant, protected by divine grace. Then, abruptly and jarringly, suddenly, like hitting a wall, he was back inside his physical body. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, unpleasant, almost claustrophobic, like being forcibly stuffed, shoved, crammed back into a container or prison that was far too small and confining and restrictive for what he had become, for what he knew himself to be now. He remained medically unconscious for several more hours. When he finally began the gradual process of waking up, returning to consciousness in his body, it happened very slowly, gradually, painfully, in distinct stages over time. His first glimmer of awareness was of mechanical beeping and humming sounds, medical monitoring equipment operating constantly, ceaselessly around him in the room. He managed to force his eyes open just slightly, just a tiny crack, and saw machines and monitors all around him everywhere, surrounding his bed with tubes and wires connected to various parts of his body attached to him. He focused his blurry, unfocused attention on one particular monitor that was displaying his blood pressure reading in glowing numbers. It showed 40/0. He stared at those numbers for several long moments, many seconds trying to process what they meant, trying to understand his situation, then slipped back down into unconsciousness, into darkness, pulled back under. Some indeterminate time later, he had no idea how long, he woke again briefly, partially. The blood pressure reading had improved somewhat, had increased. It now displayed 64/30. He felt a small flicker of hope and relief before darkness claimed him once more, pulled him back down into unconsciousness. This pattern repeated itself multiple times over the next several hours. Brief moments of partial awareness, where he would check the monitor and see the numbers slowly, gradually climbing upward into the 70s, and then the low 80s, followed by longer periods of unconsciousness and darkness, and dreams he couldn't remember. Finally, during one of his conscious periods, a nurse entered the ICU room quietly and saw his eyes open and focused, alert, tracking her movement. "Oh, thank God you're awake!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine surprise, relief, and profound gratitude. Robert looked at her with confused, disoriented eyes and said weakly, quietly, his voice raspy, "I need to talk to you. I need to understand something important." The nurse immediately shook her head firmly, but gently. "First, I need to notify the attending physician right away immediately," she explained quickly, urgently, professionally. "You've been unconscious for many, many hours. We honestly weren't at all certain you were going to survive this. We thought we were losing you multiple times. The doctor absolutely needs to know immediately that you're alert and responsive and conscious." But Robert reached out with trembling, shaking fingers and gently touched her arm softly, stopping her. "Please, just for one moment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, weak and strained. "I desperately need to understand something crucial. Why am I back here in this body, in this hospital room? I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere beautiful beyond all description. I was home, with beings I've known since the very beginning of time, since before time existed. How did I end up back here in this place, in this broken, painful body?" The nurse paused, stopped, pulled up a chair, and sat down beside his bed carefully, gently. She had undoubtedly witnessed many extraordinary things during her long nursing career, many years of dedicated service, but something about Robert's earnest confusion and genuine distress touched her heart deeply, profoundly, moved her. Robert continued, his voice trembling with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely, tears forming in his eyes. "I genuinely thought I had died. I was certain of it. I was absolutely, completely certain of it, without any doubt whatsoever. I was in a place that was infinitely more real than this hospital room, more real than anything I've ever experienced during my entire physical life on Earth. And now I'm inexplicably back here in this broken, painful body, and I honestly, truly don't understand why this happened, why I was sent back, why I'm here again." The nurse reached out and took his hand in both of hers, squeezing it gently but firmly, holding it with compassion. She looked directly into his eyes, with deep compassion and understanding, and said softly, gently, kindly, "Sweetheart, you came incredibly, unbelievably close to death, closer than most people ever come and survive to tell about it. But somehow, against all odds and expectations, by the grace of God, you pulled through and came back to us here. Now you're here in the land of the living once again, back with us, And as hard as it might be right now, as difficult as this adjustment is, you're just going to have to make peace with that reality and focus on getting yourself healthy and strong again. Focus on healing your body and moving forward. Robert genuinely appreciated her honesty and her compassionate kindness, her gentleness and understanding, but her words provided very little actual comfort to his grieving, mourning heart. Throughout the next 2 weeks of his hospital recovery period, he experienced a persistent, deep, profound sadness that seemed to permeate absolutely everything, every moment, every breath. It wasn't the kind of severe clinical depression that requires psychiatric intervention and medication and hospitalization. He could still function adequately, could engage in conversations with visitors and medical staff, could cooperate fully with the medical staff and physical therapists working with him daily on his recovery. But underneath all of that normal functioning was a profound sense of loss and mourning that wouldn't go away, wouldn't fade, wouldn't diminish. He grieved deeply for that other realm, that dimension of pure love and limitless joy, and absolute freedom and perfect peace. He could feel the vivid memory already beginning to fade and blur around the edges, which only intensified his sadness and sense of loss profoundly. It was exactly like trying desperately to hold on to a beautiful dream immediately after waking up, feeling all the precious details slip away through your fingers, no matter how hard you try to grasp and retain them, to hold them tight. He knew with certainty that eventually, perhaps soon, he might even begin to seriously question whether it had actually happened at all, might start convincing himself it was just an elaborate hallucination caused by medication interactions and severe oxygen deprivation to his brain, just a vivid dream induced by trauma. But Robert absolutely refused to allow the experience to be forgotten, dismissed, minimized, or relegated to the category of medical hallucination or drug-induced dream or fantasy. So he made a conscious, deliberate decision to start talking about it openly and honestly, with everyone who would listen. He told absolutely everyone he encountered, everyone he met, everyone who came to visit. He told his fellow firefighters and EMTs back at the station when he finally returned to work many months later after his full recovery. He told friends, family members, neighbors, acquaintances, strangers in waiting rooms, anyone who would listen for even a moment, anyone who would hear him out. He told them all essentially the same core message, the same truth, the same testimony. You need to listen to me very carefully. Please hear what I'm saying. Death is not something we should fear or dread or be terrified of. We have completely and totally misunderstood what it actually is, what it means. It's not an ending or a tragedy or something terrible and final. It's a beautiful transition to something infinitely better than this physical existence, this physical life. It's like graduating to a much higher level of existence and consciousness and being. It happens instantaneously. It's more beautiful than words can possibly describe or capture. And there is absolutely nothing at all to be afraid of, nothing to fear. Over the months and years that followed his near-death experience, people who were struggling terribly with grief and devastating loss would actively seek Robert out specifically, would come looking for him. A colleague whose adult son had died from a heroin overdose, a neighbor whose wife had been killed by a drunk driver, people who were absolutely drowning in overwhelming sorrow and pain and couldn't begin to imagine how they would ever feel remotely whole or complete again, couldn't see any way forward. Robert would sit patiently, lovingly with each grieving person and share compassionately what he had learned through his extraordinary experience. You absolutely must understand something fundamental about the nature of reality and existence and consciousness. Nobody actually truly dies in the way we think they do, in the way we've been taught. That's the crucial truth that changes absolutely everything about how we understand loss and grief and death. When someone we love deeply passes away from this physical world, we haven't actually lost them in any ultimate, final sense. They've simply stepped out of their physical body, like removing a coat or costume, and returned to their true home, their real home in the light. They're still completely and entirely themselves, still carrying the exact same personality you loved, still holding all their precious memories, still filled with all their love for you, still aware and conscious. They're just existing in a different dimension now, vibrating at a different frequency that our physical eyes and ears can't detect or perceive. And they're so much closer to you than you realize or can imagine or believe. They're literally right here beside you at this very moment right now as we speak. You simply can't perceive them with your limited physical senses, but they are absolutely present and aware and loving you, watching over you. Robert would patiently, gently explain to these grieving, suffering people that when he left his physical body and traveled through those extraordinary spiritual realms and dimensions, his fundamental core identity remained completely and perfectly intact, unchanged, unaltered. His essential personality, his characteristic sense of humor, his particular way of thinking and processing information and experiences, that internal narrative voice that constantly runs in your head, making observations and cracking jokes and asking questions and commenting on everything you see and do, all of that was still fully present and functioning perfectly, exactly as it always had. The transition from physical to non-physical existence was absolutely seamless, flawless, and perfect. He didn't transform into a different person or lose any essential aspect of himself or his identity or his memories. He simply stepped out of his physical form like removing clothing or a costume and continued being Robert, just existing in a radically different state of being and consciousness and awareness. And if that was unquestionably true for him, then it must be equally true for absolutely everyone, for every human being who has ever lived. Every single person who has ever died throughout all of human history is still fundamentally themselves, still fully conscious and aware and thinking and feeling, just no longer confined to or limited by a physical body, just no longer trapped in matter and flesh. They haven't actually gone anywhere in any real, ultimate sense. They're simply vibrating at a frequency that our physical sensory organs cannot detect or perceive or measure with our instruments. This powerful message brought profound comfort and genuine hope to many people who were suffering through terrible grief and loss and despair. Several people told Robert with tears streaming down their faces that his testimony had literally saved their lives, that they had been seriously, actively contemplating suicide to escape their unbearable emotional pain and suffering. But his words had given them hope and strength, and helped them find the courage to carry on living, to keep going, to not give up. Robert felt deeply in his soul, in his very being, that this was a significant part of his purpose, perhaps the main reason why he had been sent back to physical life, to share this liberating truth, to help suffering people understand that death is not the ultimate tragedy and permanent ending we've all been culturally conditioned to believe it is, that we've been taught to fear. But then came the inevitable pushback and social pressure, the resistance from the establishment. After approximately 10 months of openly and enthusiastically sharing his near-death experience story with anyone and everyone who would listen, a long-time co-worker and close personal friend approached Robert one afternoon at the fire station during a quiet moment between calls. The man looked uncomfortable, awkward, hesitant and nervous, clearly struggling with what he needed to say. But his message was unmistakable and clear and firm. "Hey, Robert, listen carefully to me for a minute," he said quietly, softly, glancing around nervously to make absolutely sure no one else was within earshot, that they were completely alone. "I'm telling you this as a friend who genuinely cares about you and your well-being and your future, as someone who's known you for 20 years. Some people around here, including some administrators and supervisors, and even some chiefs, are starting to talk and express serious concerns about you and your behavior. They're saying you've been acting strange or odd or different, that maybe the experience and the medications affected you more profoundly than you realize or want to admit or acknowledge. Some folks are privately suggesting, behind closed doors, that you might really benefit from talking to a professional counselor or therapist or even a psychiatrist about all this intense spiritual stuff you keep talking about constantly. I'm just saying, as your friend, you might want to be considerably more selective and careful and cautious about who you share this experience with going forward. Maybe keep it more private, more to yourself." The words cut Robert deeply and painfully, wounded him to his core. Here he was, earnestly sharing what he genuinely, absolutely believed with every fiber of his being was the most important, hopeful, liberating truth that any human being could possibly hear. Actual proof from first-hand experience that death is not the final end, that we don't permanently lose the people we love, that there's an indescribably beautiful existence waiting for every single one of us. And he was being told to shut up about it, to keep quiet, to stop talking about it, because it made people uncomfortable, or seemed crazy, or indicated mental instability, or made him seem unreliable or unfit for duty. Robert thought about similar situations throughout human history, throughout all of time. He knew from his reading that people who had profound spiritual experiences or mystical encounters often faced severe ridicule, persecution, rejection, or far worse when they tried to share what they had learned with others, with society, with the establishment. He was facing a difficult choice with real consequences and serious implications. Continue courageously speaking his truth and risk serious damage to his professional reputation and career and livelihood and ability to support his family, or stay silent and keep the transformative experience locked away inside himself where it couldn't help anyone, couldn't serve its divine purpose, couldn't bring comfort to those who desperately needed to hear it. Reluctantly, painfully, with deep sadness and resignation, Robert made the difficult, heartbreaking decision to stop talking about his experience publicly, openly. He closed his mouth, locked the memories away deep inside himself in a private place, and tried his best to act completely normal, tried to fit in, tried to be what people expected him to be. For the next 16 long, difficult, painful years, he barely mentioned his near-death experience to anyone outside his immediate family circle. He went back to his regular work routine, continued his dedicated career in emergency services with professionalism, competed in his athletic events and competitions, and lived what appeared from the outside to be a completely normal, ordinary, unremarkable life. But the vivid memory of that extraordinary night in 1994, that journey to the other side, never truly left him or faded away completely, not for a single day. It was always there, just beneath the surface of his everyday consciousness, quietly waiting patiently, persistently for its moment to re-emerge, to resurface, to be heard again. Then in 2010, Robert retired from active firefighting and emergency medical service after nearly 3 decades of dedicated, distinguished service to his community. He was in his late 50s by that point, ready and eager and relieved to begin an entirely new chapter of his life journey. A new phase, a new beginning. But almost immediately after he stopped working, as soon as he had abundant time to sit quietly in stillness and reflect deeply without the constant demands and distractions of emergency calls and training exercises and shift work and responsibilities and the structured routine, the memory of his near-death experience came flooding back into his consciousness with overwhelming, undeniable, irresistible force like a dam breaking. It was as if the experience had been dormant all these years, held carefully at bay by the relentless busyness and structure and demands of his working life. And now it was demanding his complete and total attention, demanding to be understood, demanding to be shared again. Robert became absolutely consumed, obsessed with finding deeper answers and achieving greater understanding of what had actually happened to him during those extraordinary hours that night in the hospital. He began an intensive, obsessive, all-consuming personal research project, reading absolutely everything he could possibly find about near-death experiences, consciousness studies, quantum physics, neuroscience, spirituality, mysticism, theology, comparative religion, and ancient wisdom traditions from cultures all around the world, from every spiritual tradition and path. He discovered that many traditional societies throughout human history, the mystics, the shamans, the indigenous wisdom keepers, the contemplative monks, the saints, the sages, had preserved and transmitted profound knowledge about the fundamental nature of reality and consciousness that modern Western civilization had largely forgotten, systematically dismissed, ridiculed, suppressed, or even actively hidden deliberately for various political and religious reasons. But that fascinating journey of discovery and deeper understanding, that spiritual quest, is truly a story for another time, for another day. What matters most profoundly for today, what Robert wanted every person listening to know and understand with absolute certainty and conviction, is this core truth, this essential message, this divine revelation. Death is absolutely not what we have been taught and conditioned to believe it is throughout our lives by society and religion and culture. It is not an ending, not a tragedy, not something to dread or fear with anxiety and terror and dread. It is a transition, a transformation, a graduation, a homecoming, a return to our authentic nature as eternal beings of pure consciousness and unconditional love and infinite awareness as children of God. The precious people we have loved and lost are not truly gone or annihilated or erased from existence forever. Our beloved pets and animal companions who have died have not ceased to exist or been destroyed or lost. They are all still here, still present, still existing, living and thriving in frequencies and dimensions, just slightly different from our ordinary physical reality, still completely themselves, still fully aware and conscious and loving and thinking, still absolutely filled with love for us, still watching over us, still caring about us, still connected to us by bonds of love that can never be broken. And one day, when our own appointed time finally comes to leave these temporary physical bodies behind and return home to our true home in the light, we will joyfully, gratefully, happily join them in that magnificent realm of infinite light and boundless love and eternal joy and perfect peace. That is Robert Sullivan's heartfelt testimony, his message from the other side, and his deepest, most fervent hope and prayer is that by sharing his extraordinary story, his journey, he can bring genuine comfort, lasting peace, real hope, and renewed faith to anyone who desperately needs to hear it, to anyone who is suffering or grieving or afraid or lost or searching for meaning and purpose.